Hello and welcome to a new series I'm doing called How To, and we're going to be going over the draft archetypes for M21 and how to draft them, how we rate the pick orders, the cards we want to be taking most highly, the style of deck that you're going to be playing, and the way. If you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's going to be many videos in this series as I cover all of the archetypes and how to draft each one. And you can catch me on weekday evenings on Twitch TV at Playing With Purpose. So the first deck we're going to get started with is Green-White Counters. This format overall is a very aggressive format, and this is one of the better aggressive decks. The deck relies on playing a lot of early drops and then pumping them up with synergistic +1/+1 counter cards with like Basri's Acolyte. It has a big payoff in the form of a 2-drop called Conclave Mentor, which we'll go over. And the color you're going to be looking for more than anything to be open for drafting this deck is white. White has all of the big powerful payoff cards. You can get away with playing some of the weaker green cards if your white base is very strong. You need white to be open as well because you're going to be competing with a lot of the other white aggro decks like blue-white skies and red-white aggro, which is also very powerful. A lot of the cards have very much crossover synergy between all three of those decks, so you're going to be competing against them. So once you know white is open, you can draft this deck. So let's get into the pick order. So here we have the pick order. From left to right are the most pickable cards that can be first pickable, to right where we're not even going to talk about them because they either don't fit into the deck, they fit into a different deck, or they're sideboard cards. I'm looking at this from a best of one point of view, so we're not going to be worrying about sideboard cards. All I play is ranked. I don't play traditional unless there's nothing else to do. Just to point out as well, so these columns, each of the cards in the column can be considered better than the cards to the column to the right. I'm not going to worry too much about ranking them within the column themselves, but we'll talk about their power as we go through them. So the first card is Feat of Resistance. This is a very good combat trick. It puts a counter on the target which permanently grows it, and it gives it protection. So it can protect against removal, it can enable trades without losing your own creature, so you trade Feat of Resistance for their creature, it's still a card for a card, and you permanently grow yours. So it has synergy with our deck, especially if you have Conclave Mentor out, and overall it's just a very good card. You want as many of these in your deck as you can get. Next we have Seasoned Hallowblade, one of the best 2-drops in the entire format. This card can run away with games on its own. It's phenomenal. There's very few things that can interact with it. It takes enchantments very well. It's just an all-round, all-star card. You put some counters on it, it gets even more of a problem for the opponent. You drop this on 2, it's very difficult to lose the game, unless they have a specific answer for it. Conclave Mentor is our big payoff for this deck. This is very much first pickable as a gold card. You want to be picking as many of these up as you can. If you get them, then you want to be picking as many of the +1/+1 counter cards as you can. It's just a great card all round. Invigorating Surge not only has great synergy in our deck, but it also is just a great rate on its own. +2/+2 counters for 3 mana at instant speed is great. It permanently grows a creature. If you have Conclave Mentor out, it gets even better. It's just a phenomenal card. Llanowar Visionary is probably the best green common and perhaps the best green common and uncommon in the set. It's just a great rate. A 3 mana 2/2 that draws a card and ramps. Now we don't care as much about the ramp aspect of this, but it can be relevant if you have something like Warden of the Woods in your deck and you want to cast that earlier, but we'll get to that in a moment. But all in all, you should always be taking Visionary. It's very much first pickable. It's just a great card. Thrashing Buntodon, one of the best 3-drops in the format. 3 mana 3/4 is a great rate, and 4 toughness is the perfect toughness to have in this format. It blocks most 3-drops, it blocks all 2-drops really. It has some flexibility for sacrificing it if they try and remove it and they have an artifact or enchantment you want to destroy. Just a great card. Face Fetters, one of the best removal spells in the format, which is interesting because it costs 4 mana and really a lot of the best removal spells cost 3 or less. However, the gaining life and permanently removing a creature from the battlefield is just great. This is also a first pickable card. Basri's Acolyte, brilliant 4-drop, synergistic in our deck. It goes in any of the white aggro decks because 4 mana for a 2/3 lifelink, which is relevant for racing, that gives 2 counters to 2 creatures. 1 counter each. It's just a great rate, and you should be picking Basri's Acolyte very highly as well. If you're getting past Basri's Acolyte, it's a big sign that white is open. Next we have Selfless Savior in the next column. Selfless Savior is still, pretty much a first pickable card. It's not quite as powerful as the cards to the left, however it's still very good. It protects our best creature. You then need to use removal on this before anything else, providing it's not something like Grasp of Darkness or Soulseer, but those are very specific cards. Black isn't that deep in this format, so you're not going to be seeing Grasp as often as you might think. Drowsing Pteranodon, just a great 2-mana card. It's very easy to turn on this format. It's worth noting, it's as long as you control any creature with a power 4 or greater. This includes the Pteranodon itself. So if you play this on 2 and then Pride Milking it on 3 as a 4/4, it can attack straight away. Attacking with a 4/4 on turn 2 in an aggressive deck is fantastic. Speaking of synergies, Hunter's Edge has great synergy with Pteranodon and all of the other cards in our deck, and it's just a great green removal spell because it punches, it doesn't fight, and it permanently grows the creature. Again, 4-mana removal spell. It's a very, very good rate for the removal spell though. Balefist Oak is a very solid card. It has some vulnerabilities in the fact that when it's your turn, more often than not, it's going to be a 2/3, and especially in our deck, there's very few cards that we can draw a card at instant speed to protect it. Defiant Strike being probably the only one that's going to be in your deck, if at all. However, it attacks as a 4/5, and 4/5 is huge in this format, so I will be playing Balefist Oak in any green deck that I'm playing more often than not. Warden of the Woods. You're not looking to play 6-drops in this deck because it's so aggressive. However, if you're going to play one, it should be Warden of the Woods. It's essentially hexproof, drawing 2 cards when it becomes the target of any spell or ability the opponent controls. It's great. If they target it and you can protect it, and you get to draw 2 cards, even better. So they target it with a removal spell and you play Feat of Resistance. Not only does it grow to a 6/8 attacker with Vigilance, you also then get to draw 2 cards. So it's just a great card. It gets even better if you have something like Visionary in the deck, because you can cast it a turn early. Moving on to the next column, we have Anointed Chorister. So on its face value, 1-mana 1/1 lifelink that pumps doesn't look that great, but I think in this format it's very relevant. It takes +1/+1 counters very well. In the late game, if you have a lot of spare mana, it's a good mana sink to grow it. 4/4 lifelink, even with 1 pump, is very relevant. If the game drags on a bit longer, being able to pump it twice isn't out of the realms of possibility. Then you have a 7/7 lifelink, which is just a great card. Alpine Watchdog. Really a sign of how aggressive and how pauper the format is, because a 2-mana 2/2 Vigilance is probably one of the better 2-drops in the format and one of the better creatures in the format, aside from things that do very powerful things like Basri's Acolyte. But Alpine Watchdog, you want these in your deck in any of the white aggressive decks. It's just a great rate, and adding +1/+1 counters on it just makes it even better because it can attack and block very well. Angelic Ascension doesn't fit as well into this deck as it does in other decks, but it is just a very good card. I'd play 1 at the very least in this deck if I had the opportunity to, if it provides ways to turn our creatures that are targeted with removal into a 4/4 flyer. And so very often you're not going to be leaving that much mana open, but perhaps you're leaving mana open anyway for Feat of Resistance or other combat tricks, and you happen to want to cast Ascension. It's a very flexible card, it's just very good. Basri's Solidarity is very good in this deck. However, I don't think it's a pull into white. You're going to want to be playing it if you're playing green-white counters. But for instance, it's not going to be first pickable. You're not going to open your pack 1, pick 1, see Solidarity and go, I'm playing green-white counters. But once you know that you're in this deck, very solid card. I would definitely play it. Kyrian Dryad is another solid 2-drop that gets a lot better when you're leaning more into white and less into green, because it doesn't trigger off green spells, but it does trigger off anything that isn't green or has a non-green color in its casting cost. So for instance, Conclave Mentor does trigger it. But still very solid 2-drop. If you have more than half of your deck as white cards, then you're going to be happy to play this, half or more. Cetizen Training. It cantrips when it comes into play, which is very important to make this card very good. It provides trample, so if you're going to have a lot of big creatures, if they haven't died, if you manage to protect them, and often you're going to be wanting to force through that damage, and Cetizen Training really does a good job of doing that. Fungal Rebirth is an interesting card. It doesn't fit as well into this deck as it does into other decks, but I think it's still a very good rate. You get to return your best permanent from your graveyard to your hand, and if a creature died, for instance, the creature that you're returning, then you get to create 2 1/1s, which is relevant. I think it's a fine card. I'm not going to be picking it super highly, but I do like it. Pride Malkin, great synergy, but just a great rate all round. Not only does it put a counter either on itself if you don't have any other creatures, so it's a 3-mana 3/2, which isn't brilliant, but it's fine. It also provides any creatures you have with counters on them trample, which I think is very relevant in a deck that's going to be wanting to put counters on all of its creatures. You know, it prevents chump blocking. You know, you can swing for lethal a lot more often if you have Pride Malkin on the battlefield. Gale Swooper, very solid 4-drop. Not only does it force through damage when it comes down, it also is then a fire itself, which can take +1/+1 counters and be an evasive beater while you gum up the ground with your big creatures if that's where you are in the game. But yeah, just an all-round good card for 4 mana. 3 power flying is very good. Wildwood Scourge, while a good card and has good synergy, you know, it's flexible, but you know, it's not the best card, it's not the best payoff, but it's still a good card. You know, you play this as a 3-mana 2/2 that can grow every time you give counters to other creatures. I think that's very solid. If you have Conclave Mentor out, yeah, just, you know, very, very good. But Conclave Mentor makes a lot of mediocre cards very, very good. Defiant Strike. This card is playable purely for the fact that it cantrips. It doesn't give First Strike, but it does allow some trades, and it draws a card, so it's perfectly playable. But it's, you know, it's not a very high pick. I don't know if it's particularly high pick in this column, but it's playable. I definitely include one in the deck. Next card we have is Ranger's Guile. This is a very good card to have one of in the deck, especially if you're lacking things like Feat of Resistance. Being able to protect your creatures or give +1/+1 to protect from an equal trade is very, very good. You know, I'd definitely play one in the deck, even if you have a Feat of Resistance. Maybe it doesn't make the deck if you have 3 Feat of Resistance. You know, you want to be just prioritizing casting those over it, but I think it's a very solid card. Short Sword, I think, is a solid card in any aggressive deck. It's going to be making the cut very often. It allows you to attack a lot earlier with your smaller creatures that are now bigger than your opponent's 2-drops, for instance. You know, you play Alpine Watchdog, they play Alpine Watchdog, you play Short Sword and equip it, now you can start attacking and they can't. Concordia Pegasus, it's an okay 2-drop. You know, it has synergies if you have things like Daybreak Charger in the deck. It can take counters very well as a 1/3 flyer. You know, I'm not unhappy to be playing this in the deck. It's not the best of the 2-drops, but yeah, perfectly playable. The fact that it's a 1/3 means it does need some help to be that useful. Daybreak Charger, as we just mentioned, very good in the aggressive decks. Allows early attacks with things like Concordia Pegasus. Staunch Shieldmate, allows things like Anointed Chorister to trade up and gain you some life. Attacks and blocks quite well as it is. 1 toughness is relevant as not being, you know, ideal, which is why it's in this column. However, it's still a very good aggressive card. Swift Response is an interesting one. It's a 2-mana removal spell, but the issue with it is you don't want to be leaving up so much mana where you're going to be destroying one of their attackers, leaving your creatures open. You know, if you have Feat of Resistance and Swift Response in your hand and they attack with a creature you want to kill with mana open, do you cast it and then leave your creature ready to be killed without the protection of Feat of Resistance? I'm not sure. However, if you're lacking interaction, it can certainly make the deck, which is why it's in this column and not in the same column as Secure the Scene. And it does only cost 2 mana. You know, you don't necessarily want to be putting too many of these in the deck, but I can see one making the deck. It has, you know, some issues with you either, as I said, give up protection, or you wait until your own turn and then they've already dealt the damage with the creature. Tempered Veteran, while it has a lot of synergies with the deck, is quite slow to get going. It can run away with the game if it is allowed to get going, but it only puts 1 counter on at a time. And it's a 2-mana 1/2, which isn't a very relevant body, but it's still a fine 2-drop to put in your deck, and you know, I wouldn't be unhappy to be playing it. You know, everything in this column, you know, you're not going to be terribly unhappy with having in your deck, but Tempered Veteran, you know, isn't as good as it seems on face value, but it's still a fine card. Titanic Growth is a fine combat trick. Not only does it protect and allow you to kill their creatures without losing your own, trading 1 card for their creature, it can also just kill the opponent outright. You know, you're playing a very aggressive deck, +4/+4 could be the 4 damage you need to win the game. Trackdown is an interesting card. I think it's a very good card. I think it's not as good in this deck as it is in other decks. For instance, I'd move it up a column, perhaps in some of the slower green decks. However, I wouldn't be unhappy to have one in the deck, even if it is a little slow, because it's essentially a draw 2 in green-white, which, you know, you're very much lacking in card draw. Makeshift Battalion has great synergies with the deck. If you have Conclave Mentor out, it's fantastic. Otherwise, it's pretty mediocre, unless you have ways to punch through the damage and protect your creatures, give them First Strike or something like that. But, you know, it's an okay 3-drop, and it has synergies, so, you know, it's very often going to be making the deck as one of the 3-drops. especially as, you know, the depth of cards in this format is pretty low. A lot of these cards are uncommons. Siege Striker, I think, is better in decks like red-white. However, I think it's fine in this deck. It could be a little clunky in the sense that, you know, that if they have big creatures out and you want to attack with it, or your other creatures, and they can't get through, but then you have to tap them to pump Siege Striker, you're still going to be looking at a fairly hefty crackback. So it's while it's good, it's not as good in this deck as it can be in some of the other decks, but I'd still think it's an okay 3-drop. Vryn Wingmare is a fine 3-drop. It can slow down your opponent's removal spells. It can take +1/+1 counters very well as it flies and is evasive. You know, I'm not going to be unhappy to be playing this in the deck. Bear in mind that the effect is symmetrical, so your own spells are going to cost more as well, so bear that in mind when you're leaving up things like Feat of Resistance. Truffle Snout. I think Truffle Snout is a very good card. 3 mana 3/3, Conclave Mentor out, it's a 4/4. It's a 3 mana 2/2 that gains 4 life in a race situation, and 2/2 is a relevant body, unlike 1/2. So yeah, I think Truffle Snout is a fine 3-drop to make the deck. Sky Scanner, I think, is pretty good in this deck, because we're lacking in evasive creatures very often. It replaces itself when it comes into play with a card. So yeah, I'd be happy playing one Sky Scanner. Probably rather play Sky Scanner than Makeshift Battalion. Falconer Adept is an interesting one as well. It's 4 mana. It can run away with the game. If you have plenty of ways to punch it through and it just keeps creating tokens, then it's going to run away with the game. If you don't have any way to punch it through, 4 mana 2/3 isn't very good. By this stage in the game, you could be facing down much bigger creatures and it's not going to be able to attack, in which case, you know, you just taken off a turn to play a 2/3. Aven Gagglemaster is a very good rate for the card. It's a 5 mana 4/3 flyer that gains you at least 2 life. I think this is very, very good. It's 5 mana, which is why it's lower down on the list. We don't want to be playing too many expensive spells, but if you're going to play a 5-drop, it's probably going to be Gagglemaster. As you can see, it's the only 5-drop in these first 4 columns, and the only card that we have a similar value is Warden of the Woods, which is all the way up here. Moving on to cards that, you know, might make the deck, but probably won't. We have Staunch Shieldmate. If you're struggling for early drops, it's a fine target for +1/+1 counters. If you have a bunch of Basri's Acolytes, it gets a lot better. But I don't really want to be playing a 1 mana 1/3 very often if I don't have to. But I'm not going to be crying if I have to put it in the deck. Portcullis Vine doesn't really fit the game plan of this deck because it can't attack. So if you're again lacking early drops, which if you are, then you're going to be struggling with this deck anyway. But if you're lacking with early drops, you need to slow down the opponent while you get your other cards online. Portcullis Vine isn't a terrible card. Later in the game, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. You know, it's a pretty good card. I just don't think it's a pretty good card in this deck. Again, Dub is an interesting card. We're already pumping our creatures up. I don't think Dub fits into this deck as well as it does into something like Black-White or Blue-White, even Red-White. You know, if we have ways to protect our creature, we have stuff like Seasoned Hallowblade, it gets a bit better, but all in all, I don't know if I'm happy to be playing Dub in this color pair. Next card is Warded Battlements. This card is a lot better in the Flyers decks where it wants to be sat down defending. I don't think it fits that well in the green-white deck. You know, you could play it. I think it fits into any aggressive deck, and it's a lot better than it looked at on face value when the first set first came out. But I don't think I'm that happy to be drafting it in this deck in particular. Cultivate is a good card, but I don't think it's a particularly relevant card in this deck. We're not going to be wanting to ramp that often. Yes, it pulls 2 lands out of our deck, but do you really want to be taking turn 3 off to do that? I don't think so when we want to be playing cards that we can target with Basri's Acolyte. Fierce Empath, I don't think you're going to be playing more than 1 6-drop in the deck, and if you're not playing at least 2 6-drops, I don't think this card has very much value. I just don't think it fits. Sure, if you happen to be playing, you know, Dreadmore, or you get 2 Warden of the Woods, play Fierce Empath by all means, but otherwise I think you should be very wary about playing this with only 1 6-drop or none. Well, if you have none, obviously don't play it at all. It's a 3 mana 1/1. It doesn't do anything. Palladium Mirror, again, this falls into the ramp for 3 mana category. We don't really care about ramping for 3 mana. It's not anywhere near as good as Visionary, which draws a card when it comes into play. Even though it adds an extra mana, Visionary also adds coloured mana, which is quite relevant. I think Palladium Mirror is a very good card, and I do want to be playing it a lot in other decks, just not so much in this deck. Sabertooth Mauler, I think, is a little slow. We don't have very much removal, so I think it takes a while to get going. If you're struggling for 4 drops, then I guess you could put one in the deck, but I'm not going to be too happy to be having to play a Mauler. I'd rather be playing low drops in this particular deck. Secure the Scene suffers from the 5-drop problem, and it doesn't really provide you with a very good tempo swing. So you exile any of their non-land permanents, but then they get a blocker. If you're not trampling and they just have another chump blocker, I don't think you're very happy about that. If you're really struggling for interaction, I can see playing one in the deck, but otherwise, no, I don't think we want to be playing Secure the Scene. Rambunctious Mutt, again, it's a 5-drop. It's a 5-drop that has a sometimes relevant ability, especially in Best of 1, where you don't have the option to sideboard. As far as sideboard cards go, I think this is one of the few main deckable ones in Best of 1. But otherwise, you can play it, but I wouldn't be excited about putting it in the deck. Again, if given the choice between it and a lower drop, play the lower drop. Gnarled Sage, same thing. It's a 5-mana 4/4 reach. Sometimes it's going to have vigilance and get to attack. Very often it's just going to be sat there blocking. We don't really want a 5-mana card that's going to be sat there blocking. Colossal Dreadmaw, 6-mana 6/6. It's a fine rate for a card, but it's a bit slow for what we want to be doing. You might make it in the deck with a Warden of the Woods, a Dreadmaw, and a Fierce Empath. But you're slowing the decker down a fair amount if you're doing that. If you have a couple of Llanowar Visionaries, perhaps it gets more likely that you're going to play this, because you can play it on turn 5 realistically. And then that's a very good card. Moving on to this column that we are going to briefly talk about, but these aren't cards you really want in the deck. So we have the 2 Sanctums. These aren't particularly good Sanctums. The payoff isn't really worth it. We have Ramp and we have Tapping Down. You play these 2 Sanctums, you get to tap something for 4 mana. Sure, that could be relevant, but I don't think we're playing these Sanctums. We don't really have any use for the extra mana either on your pre-combat main phase. Perhaps if this was every turn, then it might be useful because of our little feat of resistance and combat trick shenanigans, but otherwise, no, I don't think we should be playing Sanctums. Snare Spinner is not a card you want in an aggressive deck. It's very much more of a controlling card. It blocks flyers very well. It's a very good sideboard card, but I don't think you're going to be making it into the deck. And in a pinch, it's a 2-drop, and you want to be playing a lot of 2-drops in this format, but otherwise, I don't think you want to be playing Snare Spinner. Ornery Dilophosaur, I just think is not a very good rate. I don't think it's a very good rate in any of the decks. It's very much filler. It could make the deck in a pinch, which is why we are discussing it, but I don't think you're going to be wanting to play it very often. Valorous Steed is a 5-drop, but I think it's one of the worst 5-drops along with Gorehorn. Both of these cards I don't think are very good rate for 5 mana and what we want to be doing. I could see an argument for putting Valorous Steed in the deck. I could see much less of an argument for putting Gorehorn in the deck. It's there because it is a 7/3. You give it protection from something. You can smash them in the face. If you want to be playing one as your only 5 mana top end, sure, maybe it makes the deck. Very likely not though. This is the bottom of the discussable cards. Valorous Steed I just don't think is a very good card in this particular deck. And this final column on the right, as we said, these cards just aren't going to make the deck. There's some very good sideboard cards in there, but we're playing Best of 1, so they're not going to do it. So these are the pick orders for green-white counters. Go ahead and have a go with it. Maybe you disagree with some of my rankings here. If you do, why don't you drop me a comment below. As I said, you can catch me on Twitch TV, Playing with Purpose, if you want to come talk about drafting Magic with me or any other games. And have a good day. See you later.